Good afternoon or good evening. Welcome to Economics 330, Global Trade and Political Economy at the City University of New York, MAC. Today is Tuesday, September 2nd, 2025. And welcome to Office Hour and Lecture for Module 2, Week 2. And I hope you now know from this week's assessment, and I hope that everyone has had an opportunity to review the assessment for the week and is beginning to work on their assessments. But having said that, I hope that you now know that today's lecture would be on barriers to trade. This topic is even more salient today, given ongoing U.S. government's agreement on reciprocal trade negotiations, with a stated goal to resolve trade asymmetries, facilitate global market access for U.S. industries, and stimulate investment in U.S. manufacturing. The learning objectives for this module is to understand why there can be barriers to trade, despite broad acknowledgement that trade is beneficial to all trading partners. And as we interrogate this paradox, we will identify the different constituencies nationally and internationally that attempt to limit trade. Let me add that I hope you are all aware of President Trump's international trade tariff regime. It is important, of course, to distinguish the rationale for President Trump's tariff from traditional resistance and ideological resistance to free trade. Even so, and some of those ideological reasons we covered last week in mercantilist mentality, protection, and so forth, and client-patron relationship, which we would unpack in even more detail in the weeks ahead. Even so, the US government, it is worthy to note that the US government has reached a framework agreement with the United Kingdom, and it has also reached a framework agreement with the European Union. And in the weeks ahead, we will get into regional trade frameworks, and we will begin to understand how the European Union came to be the sovereign authority to negotiate trade for several European countries, indeed the leading European economies with the exception of the United Kingdom. Notably, China has taken a different approach of counter tariffs against the United States. Although their counter tariffs are fairly modest, at least relative to US tariffs, and appear calibrated to try to send a message to the US and their domestic Chinese audience without inflicting too much damage to their economy. Indeed, President Trump's tariffs are not only intended to correct non-market trade practices, but instead, according to President Trump, tariffs were issued through International Emergency Economic Powers Act to address the major threat posed by illegal aliens and deadly drugs crossing American borders, especially fentanyl. As at today, a 50% tariff has also been imposed on India as a diplomatic tool, according to the administration, the US administration, to discourage India's purchase and trade in crude oil with Russia. Demonstrably, ongoing tariff is not an outcome of conventional economic competition. So now that we've had that overview, we would now go through an overview of current events. Keep in mind that I'll be taking questions, obviously, the end of the class. So we are, as always, we're going to go through the lecture and then turn off the camera and have a Q&A. That way, students who want to watch the lecture later do not have to deal with several Q&As in between. So let us now address the learning objectives for this week's module by interrogating the following questions. The first question is to explain why trade among nations is beneficial. The World Bank Group, whom you would learn in the weeks ahead, as a stated mission to abolish poverty, acknowledges that while all countries have not benefited equally from trade, in part due to domestic political economy challenges, but overall, trade has generated unprecedented prosperity, helping to lift some 1 billion people out of poverty in recent decades. As one example, trade leads to faster productivity growth, especially for sectors and countries engaged in global value chains or GVCs. For least developed countries or LDCs, with comparative advantage or an economy's ability to produce a particular good or service at a lower opportunity cost than its trading partners. Trade provides opportunities to specialize in making single component or input products, like a keyboard, rather than a finished product such as a personal computer, where advanced economies are more competitive. Although less so, medium range countries are becoming more adept at producing basic goods like smartwatches, computers, etc. Even so, global value chains also give LDCs, which is least developed countries, access to foreign technology, know-how, and investment. Because obviously the factories are often built by multinationals coming in from other countries. And this is part of FDI attraction, of foreign direct investment attraction for the least developed countries. Additionally, consumers in especially advanced economies. So this is how we also benefit. Consumers, especially in advanced economies, enjoy a greater variety of goods and services at lower cost. Although some firms and workers in individual sectors may see their livelihood at risk due to competitive pressure. I think I mentioned last week that every class I would try to highlight keywords and phrases that are very helpful. Indeed, I would argue essential to conveying a technical understanding and having the technical tools to properly evaluate international trade and political economy issues. One of those uh, phrases is a comparative advantage. And the other phrase is obviously the ability to think dialectically, dialectical thinking. You have to look at issues from all sides to then draw an informed conclusion. As one example, I have just stated that consumers in especially advanced economies enjoy a greater variety of goods and services at a lower cost. Although some firms and workers in individual sectors may see their livelihood at risk due to increased competitive pressure. So what does this really mean? It means that countries that can produce goods and services at a lower price point, we are better off more efficiently. And part of that often includes a lower price point. We are better off purchasing those goods or services from them because it becomes cheaper for us. And we can then concentrate our efforts in making the goods and services where we have comparative advantage. So that is one benefit to consumer. But think about it in a different way. What if you used to work for a TV manufacturing company, say in Indiana? And it turns out that Samsung can open a plant in Mexico, pay them relatively much less than they're paying you in the United States, because for one, the Mexican peso has a lower value than the United States. And even so, wage rates are still lower in Mexico. So when they make that television in Mexico, all things being equal, Samsung, and I'm just picking Samsung as an example. This is nothing about all multinationals think this way, uh, generally speaking. So Samsung can now come in and sell that Mexican-built television that it brings into the United States because of the US-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement. He brings it in tariff-free. He can come to the United States and sell that television at a lower price point, which is good for consumer. But if you're the factory worker who used to work at the Samsung plant in Indiana, who is now unemployed because the plant has shuttered because he can no longer produce television competitively, that is not good news. This is bad news. Unemployment is not good. So, and I want you to recognize that public policy, doesn't matter what public policy it is, there are some members of the public that public policy would affect negatively. The real question is, on balance, will the public, i.e. society, be better off or worse off because of a policy? And is the cost to some members of the society, can it be ameliorated? If the answer is yes, 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 then obviously that policy might be on balance a good thing for society. So the second learning objective for the week is to identify the different constituencies within nations that influence trade policy. So despite aforementioned benefits, globalization is under pressure from different constituencies. Traditionally, multinational businesses are champions of international trade or globalization. Again, given the example, the theoretical example that I just gave with Samsung Television. Traditionally, multinational businesses are champions of international trade and or globalization as they seek global efficiencies to shore up profit margins and or deliver competitive pricing for consumers. And this is also a fair point to mention that multinationals do not always seek a more competitive manufacturing location or production location because they necessarily want to pass all those savings to consumers. Some of it is also to shore up their profit margins. Um, they are a commercial enterprise after all. So, although due to ongoing trade tensions, multinationals are increasingly considering nearshoring of their operations in attempt to de-risk their supply chains. And here's what that really means. Again, you would hear Donald Trump say it more blatantly to say to companies, you want to invest your plants in the United States to avoid tariffs. And he's just that blunt about the way he communicates it. He doesn't couch it in any niceties. Um, so increasingly, companies are, so after President Trump's first term, as an example, Chinese companies learned from the tariff President Trump's administration imposed on China during his first term. What Chinese company began to do was to invest in manufacturing capacity in Vietnam, in Indonesia, and especially Mexico. In fact, at some point, China stopped being the America's top trading competitor, trade partner, and Mexico became a top trade partner. Part of the reason Mexico became our top trade partner is because Chinese companies looking to de-risk access to the very precious American market decided to invest in production facilities in Mexico and therefore take advantage of USMCA and hedge against any potential tariffs against China. But now it's becoming a lot more complicated because pretty much every country has been tariffed by the United States. Pretty much, not all. I don't think there's outside of sanctions, Russia has been tariffed. So President Trump is pretty much blunt about it. Build your factories in the United States. Of course, there is also the practical question of whether the United States truly has the comparative advantage in those sectors and whether our resources as a nation is best invested in the production of non-essential goods and or services where we do not have comparative advantage, or whether we should continue to increase our capacity in higher value sectors where we have a comparative advantage. Of course, the counter argument to that is that those high value sectors may sound good in theory, but many Americans are prized are locked out of the labor force because they just don't have those kind of skills that those kinds of employment will require. So again, this is providing a 360 view of the issue. So while multinationals might love globalization and international trade, unions in particular often blame globalization for the loss of manufacturing jobs in advanced economies. Again, given the four example that I just gave with a fictitious Samsung manufacturing plant in the United States, in Indiana. Environmentalists often blame environmental degradation on outsourcing of especially heavy industries to least developed countries with weak environmental regulation and enforcement mechanisms. Service providers in especially advanced economy may also blame globalization for disruptions to supply chains of vital goods. And increasingly, and especially in the United States, there appears to be an ideological resistance to a rules-based international trading system. That is where, beyond resistance to trade, and there appears to be an increasing ideological resistance to a rules-based international trading system where rules guide the actions and constrain the excesses of nation states to where it is might makes right. Again, this is a conversation we're going to unpack in a little bit more detail in the weeks ahead. But in combination, these constituencies, among others, influence domestic policy, which affects trade policy and the global political economy. Number 3 learning objective is to explain the attitudes of different constituencies, labor, business organizations, and households towards trade. From the perspective of an advanced economy, labor, especially in low-end manufacturing, can be hostile to globalization as production is offshored to low-cost countries. Again, keeping in mind for example, about a Samsung TV plant in Indiana. Conversely, business organizations, especially multinationals, are natural champions of globalization due to inherent benefits in efficiency. Households benefit from competitive pricing on the consumption side of the equation, but households could also suffer job loss due to outsourcing of jobs and industries. These aforementioned conflicting attitudes combined with geopolitical tensions are prompting many industrialized countries to raise barriers to trade and investment and to subsidize the domestic production of goods deemed essential and or strategic. Yet, I must note, tit-for-tat trade disputes and restrictions not only ultimately drive up prices higher with associated inflationary pressure, they also weaken the rules-based global trading regime centered on the World Trade Organization. And again, in the weeks ahead, we will unpack the World Trade Organization. Your part of your assignment last week touched on the Smooth Parley Act, and you can see how many of you answered correctly on how the Smooth Parley Act actually exacerbated the depression and globalized resistance to trade because, of course, the Europeans countered. This phenomenon, in part, explains why smaller developing economies cannot be self-sufficient and need to export and import. Furthermore, many developing countries do not have the fiscal resources to match advanced economies' domestic production subsidy. This fiscal imbalance can exacerbate the need for smaller developing economies to seek IMF loan facilities, a topic we shall cover in more detail in the weeks ahead. The fourth question is learning objective is to distinguish the advantages and disadvantages of international trade to different constituencies in a country. So international trade offers the global South opportunities to grow their economy and improve the complexity of their labor force through industrialization. On the other hand, the critical perspective of international political economy centered on client-patron unequal economic relationship will argue that the terms of international trade are too often exploitative of the global South. Additionally, due to weak regulatory regimes and cost pressures, industrialization can often lead to pollution in the global South. Rivers and land pollution with associated public health challenges from garment and shipbreaking industries in the country of Bangladesh are classic examples of environmental damage from industrialization. So many in Dakar would tell you about the pollution, although I should also know that the Indonesian government is putting in great effort to try to mitigate some of the industrial pollution. So for the global north, international trade lends to efficiency of markets and price competitive products and services. Again, multinationals tend to source their goods and services from the most efficient point in the global supply chain. And this leads to all things being equal to more competitive prices. But on the other hand, and as I've mentioned, international trade for the global north can also lead to deindustrialization and the loss of some manufacturing jobs and other low and high wage critical sector jobs, such as farming or chips manufacturing. The fifth learning objective is to research upon and analyze how international trade can enhance economic growth. As we contemplate a response, right, it may be instructive to ground our research around cognitive frameworks. You have to have the tools to really research upon and analyze how international trade can enhance economic growth. The first tool is, as I mentioned previously, is dialectical thinking, which is to examine an issue from all sides, not just from one side. The second tool is comparative advantage, which I've also mentioned. And again, the definition is an economy's ability to produce a particular good or service at a lower opportunity cost than its trading partners. Next week, as we wind down this week's lecture, keep in mind that next week's lecture, but it will be on managing the global economy. what are some of the institutions, and we will touch on how some of those institutions are proving incapable. We will interrogate whether those institutions are proving themselves capable of managing global trading conflict and whether the world has faced the international order has faced similar challenges in the past. Specifically, we will examine how global trade is managed among nations and review the institutions that have been set up since World War II to manage global trade, their histories, and their different roles. With this, I would shut down the recording and take questions as necessary, and whether it be for the class or general office hour questions. Thank you.